Now, is sexuality just another difference that we're talking about, or is there something specific about it? So, and looking at the pattern of how differences are accommodated, can we say that we could have simply a theory of difference rather than talking about specific differences as if one thing doesn't have anything to do with another? So that is the main idea I'm going to talk about. All right. Before I do that, can I ask people, what did you get out of yesterday's discussion? So you at least got 4 or 5 perspectives, and so the same issue can be discussed at so many levels and from so many different angles. Was it useful or confusing or interesting information but nothing more? So categorize what you did yesterday. Any comment? Any observation? Because that is one of the questions I'm giving you in your... So can I say that Professor Mustafa, and not as any negative comment at all, but Professor Mustafa's line was a standard legal line. My line was slightly deviant legal line. Professor Kannan's line was a non-legal line. Vijay's angle was that she was using the concepts but extending them to an area that we usually don't think about. Professor Quinn was giving you a comparative analysis of how the ideas are used in the European context. So were all of them saying the same thing, similar things, different things? What do you say? So I've got your question ready, your assessment task ready. So I've given you two statements, and I want you to pick one of them, and I'll send it tonight. I want you to pick one of them and then argue on that, and I've made it very clear in the instructions that you will not be marked upon your point of view. You will be marked upon how you argue for your point of view. And I'm hoping that you will use the available literature and the available ideas to be able to support your argument. When you're making an argument, a complete argument is where you can counter the other side of the argument. So whatever position you take, you will have to still respond to what is the other view. So a public and private divide with regard to religion is a reasonable way of organizing life. Yes or no? Can you imagine the world without us using public and private distinctions? That's what Professor Quinn said at the end, that whatever the limitations, I would not suggest that we can give up the distinction. What would happen if we gave up the distinction? Can you imagine a legal system where there are no limits as to what can be regulated and what can't be regulated? So one of the biggest arguments about dividing the world into public and private spheres is that it is a way of curtailing the reach of the state into certain areas of your life. But first question, do you see that this is the idea that is used with respect to religious personal laws in India? That is, Professor Mustafa said that the court has decided right at the beginning, after the constitution, that religious personal laws are not laws. Then if they are not laws, then whether they are in conformity with the constitution or not doesn't matter. And if the argument is that all religious personal laws in some way or another give women lesser rights than men, then what is the remedy or what is the avenue available to women to argue for legal equality? How would you move forward on that? Have you guys done family law? So you do know what I'm talking about, yeah? So all religious personal laws give women slightly or more than slightly lesser rights in the name that these are religious laws, and if they are religious laws, really it's no business of anyone other than the particular community to decide how to modify them. And if the court is saying that these are not laws in force, then the argument about using the constitution to argue that they are unconstitutional doesn't apply. But the history of courts and religious personal laws is that again and again people have tried to go to the court and say strike them down as unconstitutional because they conflict with the fundamental right to equality. Every time the court has found a reason to not do so. They just don't entertain the petition. So you don't have to decide on substantive arguments, you just don't entertain the petition. So as a woman who's wanting to change or as a man who thinks that this ought to be changed, what are your avenues? If lawyers can't think it, who will? The rest of the society is not worrying about these issues. The legislature would do it? On what basis? Can you imagine? One argument could be that we make all rights equal, irrespective of which religious law it is. Can you imagine another model? So Uniform Civil Code was one of the provisions in the directive principles, and the argument was that that's one way of creating equal legal rights for men and women in areas of family law, but the politics of the situation of the issue is such that nobody really wants to go down that track. All right, this is the impasse that you are in. You are advisors to the government. Now tell me how can we move forward? I'm a progressive leader and I want to change things. Can you imagine how you would go forward? Can you suggest how the government should go forward? All you consultants, you're not going to get paid if you don't tell me. The point that I'm trying to make, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, is that our imaginations don't allow us to get out of thinking in terms that are made to look like that these are inevitable terms. So what are we talking about? Religious personal laws and the state, that is the secular state. How do they interact? Basically, we go around in circles and not much changes. So if you wanted to change the discourse of this issue, can you think of a way of doing it? Uniform Civil Code discourse doesn't work because too much political baggage is attached to that. So how would you go about it? Do you know in India that children can be adopted? Under what law? Tell us loudly. I don't know, that's why I'm asking. I mean, I don't know the name of the legislature. Huh? Hindu adoption, no, that's only for Hindu children, all children. Hindu Adoption Act is there, but that's only for Hindu children. I'm saying for all children. So that is the point that I'm trying to make, that Juvenile Justice Act was modified, and basically it said that if a child is a neglected child, then the child can be adopted, and there are no restrictions about what the child is and who the adoptive parents are going to be. In other words, we use the subterfuge of Juvenile Justice Act to do something that wasn't allowed to be done for 50, 60 years since Hindu, not even Hindu, since the Constitution was enacted. The point is that adoption has always been entangled in this discussion about whether my religion allows it to happen or not. Now, what possibly could be a problem with adoption that my religion may not allow me to adopt? So, even if you haven't done the topic, can you think about it? That what could be the objection to the law allowing adoption of children?
Ma'am, one of the conservative view of religion would be that it is not my blood, so it may be impure.
It's not my blood, it may be impure. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, but once you've adopted a child, it is a legal fiction. Then giving property, why should that be a problem?
Are the people who would benefit if you do not adopt?
All right. So, yeah, that's true, but like that doesn't take you very far in any other area of law. One of the biggest struggles that people wanting to bring in an adoption law is basically coming from Islamic leaders who are saying that Islam lays down the proportion of property that can be given to various relatives. And if adoption happens, and this is the point you're making, but what I'm saying is it's not only a resistance to the idea that my property will be shared more widely now, but it is used as a religious argument that Islam, Sharia lays down the proportions that can be given, and it does not allow us to, that is humans to, vary that proportion of how the property is inherited. This has been a fundamental argument that has prevented adoption being legislated for not only Muslims but every other community except Hindus. Why are Hindus allowed to adopt? Under Hindu law. But that's the concept of adoption. So what is the concept of adoption is? So that was the Hindu logic of it. But your point is that all right, you can get a child into the family to do the rituals, etc. Why do you have to give them property? In Hindu law and in basically every other law where adoption is allowed, it is what we call a legal fiction. The fiction is that the child wasn't born in this family, but for every practical purpose it will be treated as it was born in that family. So if that is the fiction you are using, then you basically can't say that you can do the rituals but you can't inherit the property. But alright, Hindus had this past practice going, so the legislature just enacted it. Muslims seem to have a total prohibition or a possibility of prohibition. Could it be circumvented, that prohibition? Considering that one of the forces for, one of the arguments for adoption is that it is good for the child. That is, a child who doesn't have any family, doesn't have anyone looking after them, we are trying to make it like it is a benefit to the child. If that is your starting motivation, the Islamic prohibition that you cannot modify the shares of property, can you work with it and still allow adoption? The kind of things you are saying that maybe allow adoption, but say property distribution will not apply to you. But is that an argument that we have discussed? Absolutely not. What about Christianity? What is their problem? Adoption is a very well-known European idea. We've got Christian laws that are basically copying the, as I said yesterday, the 1860s then English laws. Then why don't we allow adoption to Christians? I can't find any religious argument. I can't find any impediment to it. But when, yeah. So then they should allow adoption in at least, if not out. You got the point? So every time an adoption law has been proposed, the church leaders have objected on the grounds that it is against our religion. And the government has accepted that argument. But nobody really tries to find out where in religion does it say, in Christian religion, that you shall not adopt. Secondly, the Christian law that we apply in India, can you really call it religious law except for the fact that it applies to the Christian community? That it is all based on legislation. There is not even a pretense that it is based on anything other than the then existing English legislation. So the point I'm trying to make is that we work with this idea that religious personal laws are somehow outside the jurisdiction of the state. Why? Because it is to do with religion, and religion is a private sphere activity, and that's why we don't do anything about it. And what is the consequence? Inequalities for women are then considered inevitable. Nothing can be done about it. Along comes the court and says it's not law, so we don't really have a contradiction in a constitution, so we don't need to do that either. Do you see the enormity of the problem? That basically we are using legal concepts of public and private, religious freedom, and religious identity as givens that cannot be questioned. If we don't question them, then do you think the doctors and engineers are going to question them? It is your profession. You are the guys who are supposed to think about laws. If it is a non-issue for us, can you imagine that for the rest of the society it's just a given? We live with an Indian penal code which was enacted in 1800s. We can live with family laws that were enacted much before that. So this is the point that Davis has been making throughout, that how the law manages to justify existing inequalities is by the use of categories. It makes it look like that it is an inevitable state of affairs. So who's going to argue that if personal laws are religious laws, then we have freedom of religion and then we don't even go there? The discussion yesterday was that is it acceptable device that the court is making a distinction between essential and inessential parts of religion. You don't even get to the concept of religious personal laws. So whether religious personal laws are, first, I'm not accepting that this is the way to go, but that's the practice of our courts, that they make a distinction between essential and inessential aspects of religion. This categorization, does it help you deal with the issue of religious personal law? Could you say that religious personal laws fall in the category of inessential aspects of religion? Could you? I don't know, I'm asking. Will it stop me being a good Hindu if I if I did something that my law didn't allow me to do? Will it stop me? I'm reluctant to use this example because it looks like that I'm targeting Islam, but does it prevent me from being a good Muslim if I can't divorce my wife by triple talaq? So essential or inessential? So how come no court has applied that test? Because we say that religious personal laws are not laws, then we don't need to worry about it. But if they are not laws, what are the courts doing enforcing them? Do courts enforce any other aspect of your religion? When they make a distinction between essential and inessential, they say essential parts are outside of state intervention. Inessential parts can be looked at. But why aren't they willing to look at religious personal laws under that categorization? So you have created a category called religious personal law, and you have assumed that it is religion. Then you have assumed that it is essential aspects of religion, so we don't need to worry about it. Shouldn't we be all jumping up and down? Okay, this is the standard way of arguing. I'm asking you, is there an alternative way of arguing that you can imagine? Your brief is that you have to make a fair family law for everyone. Could you do that? What would your fair family law look like? What are the bare minimums that you would want a fair family law to have?
So the problem arises when your family law exceeds or devalues the constitutional principles. So
every law, no law can devalue constitution, that's a given. So you're starting from a clean slate. Okay, now what kind of a family law do you think would look like a fair family law? Okay.
Essentially, men and women have the same rights rather than women being on a men being on a pedestal.
So what kind of rights are involved in family law?
Property.
What
being
property?
Ancestral or self-acquired. Like
Property.
immovable property. No, all property. Yeah.
All property?
All property.
All right. Why is property a family law issue and not a property law issue?
That is good.
That you have, you inherit property, but what if that is the case and you can say that there is a property law that deals with it, then why should family law have to deal with property issues? No, don't go there. You're starting from the scratch. Okay, leave that aside. I'm accepting that your membership of a family can give you certain rights. Most of the time, there's succession rights. Most of the time, if you're not saying that it is a co-parsonary, etc., which is probably not for most people, it's not relevant. Leave that aside, bracket it for the timing. You're getting married. All right, all of you, individuals, you have a partner tomorrow. You have a life for 10 years together, you have a life, the marriage finishes. Do you think property division is an issue? Is an issue? Should be an issue? What are you saying? Succession act is not relevant. Succession act only comes in when the other person is dead. Okay, I agree. Now, how should they be regulated is what I'm asking. So what I'm saying to you is we are so entangled in thinking about rights to do with family law as religion oriented. Alright, leave that aside. I'm asking you to start again and make a fair family law. What are the kinds of things you will need to think about? Tell me. You have to enter into a relationship. You want it to be a marriage. You want it to be a heterosexual marriage. Yeah? Why? What if I want to be with a same-sex partner? What gave you the right to define marriage as a heterosexual union? Majority opinion? Do you live by majority opinion in everything else? If the majority opinion is that women should be denied equality, will you agree to that? Majority opinion is that the husband can beat his wife at least once in 6 months. Will you agree with that? No laws are justified in a democracy by reference to majority opinion. So what are they justified by? If it is a criminal law, it is justified by the harm principle. If it is other things, and family is a island if you like, basically the argument is when two people come together and they create a family, there is division of labor happening to look after the children primarily. Okay? Now, when you have to look after the children, basically the argument is that not both of you can be as economic actor as the other one. So you have to make a choice. Somebody has to take a little bit of a back step to say that family comes first and the other person then becomes the economic contributor and one person becomes the caregiver. Now, can you put male and female on that? You can do. I don't need to tell you. Nothing in law says that women have to be primary carers, but we live in a society where they are. What are the consequences? So we are also living in a society where relationships do come to an end. When they come to an end, how should the law deal with it? Should it say that the primary carer, who is not a strong economic actor, should be paid maintenance? Should be paid maintenance? Or something else? In the 10 years that you've been together, you have accumulated X amount of wealth. Who does it belong to? Both? But it's in one person's name usually. The person who pays for it gets the legal title. So what I'm trying to say is that these are the issues that need to be addressed when you're talking about a fair family law. We don't get there. We are stuck in this religion allows that religion doesn't allow that. The main issue doesn't even get named, leave alone addressed. So the first point that I want to make with this example is that ethnicity or ethnic differences in that you belong to this community or that community gets replicated like that. That ethnic difference also has a gender consequence to it. Now, in the name of religious personal laws, we have washed our hands off a situation where majority of women in family laws in India have lesser rights than men. And we call ourselves what was the ad campaign some years ago? India Shining. Right? Really shining? And it's not only a women's issue, it was also men's issue because men are the beneficiaries of the system. And we as legal thinkers are basically saying too bad, too complicated, political issue, minority issue, and the rest of it, instead of challenging the very categories with which discussion is organized. So that's what I'm saying, that one way of proceeding forward is to say, keep your religion, keep your religious personal laws, but if it is a religion area and you say that nobody else can interfere, fine. But then if it is a religious, let me call it a right, why do you come to the state to enforce your religious right? Do you see the point? That first you say it is to do with religion, keep out of it. Then you say, this is what my religion gives me, now enforce that right. So make up your mind, is it something that you want state interference in it or not? You can't have it both ways, but we have it both ways at the moment. So the state of affairs that we have, I think it should be a concern for everyone that our family law issues need to be reframed. That is, yes, we acknowledge that it is a politically sensitive issue. Find a way around it. Why have you all washed your hands off it and said, this is what Hindu law does and this is what Christian law does, etc. Juvenile Justice Act did one little intervention and said, okay, we'll never get a consensus on what every community can agree about. Let's bring it in to the back door. And basically adoptions now happen under a federal law, but the only issue here is that the child has to be first qualified as a, classified as a neglected child for the legislation to become available as a mechanism. Do you have the, who has the mic? Mic.
What they've also done is that they have, by bringing it under the Juvenile Justice Act, they have avoided the whole issue of property. Of property.
Absolutely.
Because the child as such who may be adopted but has no real entitlements in the family that you're adopted, if the family provides for, well and good. If the family doesn't provide for, the law doesn't have an objection. And to that extent, I would say the juvenile justice adoption is a secondary, or like a, what is it called, a second rate kind of
It's not a desirable outcome.
not just not desirable, it's also like, you are, what is it, that specific term that you use, when you are a second-rate citizen, or you have not the best thing, but you have the next best, or the best we can give you in the circumstances. That's one. And it does, because, see, when the rest of your law is personal law driven, and you have brought in your adoption through the Juvenile Justice Act, all of you who've done HAMA know that you are only permitted to adopt one son and one daughter. If you want to adopt two sons or two daughters or two sons and one daughter, any combination, you can't. So then your only other option, even as a Hindu, is to go to the Juvenile Justice Act. So for me, the kind of concern then remains, all right, that second son or second daughter, exactly what are their entitlements vis-a-vis the same family, and you're going to have one child who's adopted as being part of the family, and one child who's just adopted and doesn't get all the entitlements. Yeah.
So you're using the fiction of adoption, the legal fiction of adoption, but making it into a two-tier thing. And also this fear that somehow property apportionments will prevent people from wanting to adopt. Once you adopt a child, do you necessarily have to give them a share in the property? I mean, they're legally entitled to, but do you have to give them a share in the property? Do you have to give your natural born child a share of the property? Huh? Sorry? Say that again. That's it.
So if you will your property away, then you don't have.
All right. So think about it, that under Hindu law, basically, the provision is that there is no limit on what amount of property or what proportion of property you can will away. So you can basically deny any property to your child if you wish to. The point I'm trying to make is, yes, But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are many examples where the law actually allows you to get out of the legal regulation that these are the succession rules that apply. So, don't you think as legal thinkers, as young people who are going to set up your lives in next 2 to 5 years, don't you think that you deserve a better legal regulation than what you have? Where will it come from? All right. This is the point about that ethnic differences get legitimized, get naturalized by the use of such and such categories. Coming very quickly to sexualities, basically what is the argument here? That is, when postmodernist, post-structuralist kind of writing starts happening, they are saying that discrimination or disadvantage happens on many grounds. Last time we saw that what does racial discrimination or racial disadvantage look like? It is not only that the law is race neutral, the disadvantage happens through various devices and at various levels. Today we are talking about sexuality, that is, does the law make a difference between you and somebody else on the grounds of their sexuality? So, I mean, we are still living with a criminal law which says that same-sex relationships are a crime. Leave that aside. British heritage, colonial dominance continuing. What do the British do with regard to same-sex relationships now? Louder, louder. It is not criminal offense, and also they allow same-sex partnerships to be legally recognized. And what are we doing? What are we doing? In the name of that, this was a law that was enacted by the British rulers who have well and truly left the country and gone away, and we still continue with that as if it represents our current sexual morality. So all of you probably are aware of the big debate that happened between Hart and Devlin in English law. Do you know the debate? Does anyone know the debate? I think you do. Hold on. Give us. Doesn't matter, whatever you know. I don't want to put you on the spot, but tell us what you know. So what was the debate, do you know?
Homosexuality should be criminalized.
Decriminalized.
Yeah, decriminalized.
So the point being that homosexuality was a crime in English law for a certain time. They actually had a huge debate and law reform, basically decriminalizing it. We continue with it still being a crime. Alright, the debate, why I brought the debate up was that the argument was that what is the rationale for criminalizing consensual relationships, same-sex relationships between two adults. That is, there is no element of exploitation. There is no argument that somebody is taking advantage of somebody else. It is an act that is agreed to by two adults. What's your problem? Can you tell me? Can you write a brief to the law minister that what is happening under our criminal law is actually dinosaur time idea? If you had to draft a 500 words memorandum to the law minister, could you do it? What kind of arguments would you make for decriminalization of same-sex relationships between consenting adults?
And one of the arguments which are put forth for maintenance of Section 377 is it is unnatural offences. If we struck down this legislature, it will be it will be harmful for animals, because in the act it is written that intercourse with animals.
Okay,
So-
leave that aside. Everything else.
So again, now it becomes the responsibility of the legislature to make a new law, because
I'm asking you to advise the legislature. What would be the argument?
to modify this
Why?
section.
Why? Just because I'm saying?
No.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Basically give some scientific examples that,
Give me.
ma'am, there's, I don't know, there is X chromosome and Y chromosome, so there is,
How does chromosome matter? We are not talking about reproduction.
there is an argument which I don't,
I don't want to push you, but I want everyone to think about it, that every argument that you're making is, be careful what are the assumptions on which it is being made. I think somebody wanted the mic there.
So then, what it depends on what kind of government is. So
No, I don't care. Just give me a legal argument.
so legal argument, like I'll be coming with this, I'll be citing religious texts where it is
Your religion, what's that got to do with my religion?
because in the end the government which is sitting there.
No. We are a secular country. You cannot justify on religious grounds. So
But-
that's out.
It's like practically it,
No, that's not. Even if you want it to be a religious value, you cannot couch it in those terms. You will have to formulate your argument in secular terms, because there's simply no scope in our system to say that this is my religious value, that's why it ought to be.
Ma'am, why I say so is because it is tracked. The reason is tracked for not allowing homosexuality is tracked from the same religion or the text which is. So we have text quoting.
Which one?
I
I'm
I'll
not
tell you.
going to accept that argument, but I'm just interested. Which text says so? Yeah. Okay, we can look at it later. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, so IPC doesn't say that this particular, law is for one particular religion or traces back to this
No.
particular.
Your job is to say why this shouldn't be there. It's not to justify what is there.
I'm coming to that only. So while we have this section and when we have justifications like this, that the reason behind this provision is because there are some text in some religion or multiple religion justifying this section, we can't say that this is not under, say, Hindu code or Christian law.
Accept it.
Yeah.
And what is the positive reason why this law should be repealed?
Secondly, so according to international norms of human rights, each and every person are granted equal rights. We have respected, male, females, sexual autonomy, their freedom. Then why only target one particular group of people who come under that provision, and their sexual autonomy is governed by the state
All right.
through the means of legislation?
Yeah, can everyone note this, please? I want you to have a list of reasons by the end of this class. So what you're saying is, international law demands that we have equality between people, and it's not only between men and women, it should be between.
Thirdly, we would also have to, so when we have it in today's scenario where laws on, inside IPC only, when laws on, rape and other things are being amended, is it not time to also relook on that?
That we are starting from that assumption that it needs.
Yeah. And fourthly, when we are discussing this provision, is it not necessary to take the opinion of the person whom this provision is being affected, should their representation not be in, say, legislature while when we are discussing this amendment or something?
Cover that an equality argument. That why
Yeah.
deny me equality on basis of my
Yeah.
sexuality. Okay, I'm just going to give it to the other end of the. Okay.
I think what I was trying to say is partly covered by him, but I was looking at it in terms of the Indian context. So this was mostly the argument made in the NAS Foundation case as well as the Nalsa Union case. So they particularly talked about how equality must not be limited to sex, must also encompass sexual orientation. So, okay, you have, when you categorize sex and gender to be different, you also try to talk about what all components come under sex, and sexual orientation must necessarily be something that sex should be encompassing. So if you're making a provision such that you are not allowing any non-penile vaginal sort of intercourse, basically nothing that is procreational, you are particularly discriminating against one section of the society whose sexual orientation does not conform with such a standard.
All right.
So,
Okay. So second argument.
Well, I was just talking about the public and private divide in which they're not harming anyone. So why is it that we're discriminating against them? Because even if you look at it, it's a private act between two individuals and there is no harm to anyone in any way. So why?
All right. So this was the. Okay, you might as well say something now. No, you're nothing to say? All right. Okay, so, think, yeah. Right at the back, please.
One of the arguments is that it is a slippery, it will lead to slippery slope. Like people will then argue for like incestuous relationship, and as she said, they will try to like violate like animals and all violations. So in private acts, like it will lead to slippery slope. But what I feel is that they don't have any choice. Ma'am, homosexuals don't have any choice. If like a person likes, a male likes male, he does not have any choice to like female or something. But in incestuous relationship, he can have.
All right. Okay.
Come through some literature which says that sexuality per se is flexible also. I mean, so it's not stagnant. So that was just a point which I was trying to add to this point. So section 377, I think why is it wrong is, it also prescribes only a particular kind of sexual activity which is allowed between a male and men and women also. Any other activity, sexual activity which is not conformed to that is also unnatural as per section 377.
All right.
My argument basically would be that your sexual desire, your preference is a very integral part of your own personhood, and if you are not allowed to evolve and develop it or indulge in it in accordance with, then you are in some way denying not just my liberty but my humanness and all of that. And it's like the whole the importance you give to the fact of indulgence of desire as a way of developing personality. And the fact that it is consensual, the point which was made earlier, it's in no way harming anybody, but if you prevent me from doing it or you impose another, then you to that extent deny me my humanness and my integral personhood. That would be mine.
So basically what we're getting at is that the conventional liberal argument is that curtailment of liberty should happen only when harm is caused by my conduct to somebody else. Everything else, a liberal would say, should be the field of autonomy or freedom from legal regulation. So whether the law comes in and says you're not allowed to have same-sex relationships, it should first be able to establish that there is a harm happening that is to be prevented. But the point here is that what is the harm that we are talking about? Public morality. Is it any business of the law to be enforcing public morality? We spend all our lives saying law is different than morals. Aren't we walking into that trap itself, that law and morality are supposed to be different? Yeah? But every law has a value preference. The point here is that the value preference of the law is heterosexuality rather than same-sex relationships. On what basis? So the argument is not that the law should not have moral preferences. Every law has a value preference. The argument is, show me what is the problem with this value preference. And one of the arguments is that it basically, you have to show me that some harm is being caused. Public morality harm doesn't cut in a literal understanding. The second point is that if you say that these are relationships that are happening in the private, aren't you buying into the public-private divide all over again? So because I'm doing it in the private, it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Not because there is harm or not harm, but because in the private sphere the harm principle doesn't operate. Think about it very, very carefully. So if you're going to say that this is a private sphere activity, the conventional argument is, conventional, I'm not saying it happens like that, is that the harm principle only operates in the public sphere. The sphere of private is supposed to be the sphere of freedom where harm doesn't operate. Why? Because the law doesn't operate. This is the doctrine, this is the philosophy. But is the private sphere free of legal regulation? It's a claim that it is free of legal regulation. A lot of our private sphere activities get regulated, and in some ways what happens in family relationships is also considered private sphere activity. Are family relationships regulated or not regulated by the law? So one of the arguments is that this public-private way of dividing the world sort of pretends that private is the sphere of non-regulation. Regulation happens, but it happens selectively. So domestic violence is a good example. Till very recently, domestic violence was not regulated on what basis? Everywhere else violence is a problem, but in personal relations it is not. Why not? Why not?
So what is the law is saying is that public है, private है, public में harm करो, harm है, private में it's not. So shouldn't it instead be that if there is harm happening, it becomes public, and if it's consensual, it's private?
Alright, very good. If it is harm happening, it doesn't matter where it is happening, we'll regulate it. What about sexual harassment? Was it always considered a harm that needs to be regulated?
What if in the case when the definition of harm is, constructed on the basis of morality?
Doesn't matter. So you have to be able to argue it. So I'll come back to that point, but on whatever basis it is argued, but first let us say, when is something defined as a harm? So one of the big things of feminism has been that the harms that happen to women are not even defined as harm in legal terms. So sexual harassment was not an offense. Why not? Because it is not considered harm enough. It's only now that we are dragging our feet and saying that some kind of conduct will be called sexual harassment, and that's why it is prohibited by law, etc.
I have this one anxiety between the distinction between private and privacy. You know, in the sense of to be saying that, all right, the whole business of regulating or not regulating the private has also a connect with the whole notion of privacy, especially in the relation of, in the context of sexual relations. Because you do believe that a certain component of privacy is integral to your being able to sort of undertake whatever sort of preferences that you may have without, like, you know, some kind of a constant surveillance happening of you. So I would sort of agree with the point which Matthew was making when he said that the division should be on the strength of the harm, on the fact of the harm, not the fact of where the activity happened.
Absolutely. So I wasn't suggesting that what is considered private should then be harm doesn't operate there, but that is one way it has been understood historically. And what has been the effort of feminists is to redefine various activities as harm which were not considered harm before. So that is the point about domestic violence also. It was a private sphere activity. By definition, it wasn't considered harm. Sexual harassment is not a private activity. It happens in your public interactions, mostly in employment situations. It is only like now 2013 or something that our law has said that it will be considered a kind of a offense. Why did it take us so long to realize that just because of my gender, I shouldn't have to put up with unwelcome situations in my employment situation? Why did it take us so long to realize that it is a harm that needs to be named as a harm? With regard to same-sex relationships, the question is the other way. What is the harm that you're trying to prevent? So the argument that it is public morality, then the question is it any business of the law to be enforcing public morality? Okay, not that law doesn't have a moral preference. Every law comes from a value preference. But is it any business of the law to be enforcing public morality? So the Hart-Devlin debate, which is a famous debate in jurisprudence literature, is basically between Hart saying that it is no business of the law in a secular society to be enforcing public morality. Devlin's argument is that as a society we will go down the drain if we do not enforce public morality. It's a fairly sophisticated debate. I don't have the time to tell you the details, but one of the replies of Hart to Devlin was that it wasn't so long ago that we burned women as witches in the name of that this is what people think is the right thing to do. So do you get the point that in a liberal society, in a supposedly atmosphere where individuals are supposed to be able to do what they want, state's interference has to be defined very, very carefully. And I think some of you made the point that by not allowing me this freedom, you're actually causing harm to me. Okay, where does it say that the law cannot cause harm to me? The law says we will regulate your freedom if your activity is curtailing somebody else's freedom because that constitutes harm. Where in your legal thinking do you find that the law should not harm the individual? Yeah, I'm just being provocative. In that, basically I'm saying that it is the self-publicity of the liberal legal system which says that we are about freedom, we are about autonomy, we are about creating a situation where the society is a rule of law society and it is about fairness and justice. This is not how same-sex people understand the legal system to be. This is not how feminists understood the legal system to be. This is not how the racial minorities have understood the legal system to be. So the point is that the alternative marginalized views of the dominant view is that law was never about fairness. So that the law should not harm me is the argument that is being made by the marginalized communities, and saying how you organize your word actually causes harm to me.
I sort of felt that if we connect back to the kind of point that was made through several of the lectures on how this, this assumption of neutrality and objectivity, which has been put out as that, all right, if we are talking about the rule of law, we are being neutral and objective, and as a result of which law needs to be self-referential. We don't need any other external this thing. We are offering this as an equal, opportunity for all. I think the destruction of that happens when you start looking at marginalized communities who then say, what is neutral about it? This is against me. What is neutral about it? It is sexist, which means it's not about women. It is racist, means it is not about people from a specific kind of a racial genealogy. It is ableist, it is, it's a whole range of ways in which that neutrality posture gets destroyed and exploded is only when you start looking at what the law does to excluded communities.
Absolutely. So not only that the community is like that, it is what the law does to me as a marginalized member of whatever group is the point that is made by most critical legal theorists, that what you call fairness, what you call freedom, actually turns out to be that it is debilitating me, it is discriminating against me, yet there is no vocabulary to name it as a problem. Alright, this is what is also called in basically sexuality literature, that the heteronormativity of the law is not even identified. So what do you understand by this big word, heteronormativity? Can you kindly write it down and Google it for yourselves and find out what is meant by the term? It's alright. It's a jargonist. They know the idea, but they probably don't know the classification or the category. And I would like all of you to be able to, because if we are talking about sexuality in law and how it is regulated, the central argument is that they are targeting the heteronormativity of the law, meaning that basically heterosexual relationships are considered normal and everything else flows from that. So that's why I asked you, if you had to argue for a same-sex relationship to be classified as marriage, what would your argument be? So the point, I got distracted because we said that we don't even we criminalize same-sex relationships. Where is the scope, where is the space for us exploring the possibility that marriage might include same-sex relationships? So this is the point about what is possible to be argued at any given time. You don't even accept that the criminalization of this relationship is a problem. Where do you go to start arguing about same-sex marriage? You'll be run out of the town basically because you're asking for such airy-fairy things. It doesn't really matter to anyone. So this is just to make the point that it's not part of our culture. So this is, yesterday we had this discussion about feminists and use of makeup. The point that I was trying to make is that basically if you are using makeup, initially feminists had to target it to problematize an idea that women have to look beautiful And there's so much of cosmetics industry and the rest of it to the situation where feminists had the space, the mental space and the conceptual space to say, to be a feminist means anything. Alright, I have the autonomy not to have to conform to social expectations or stereotypes. But if I have the freedom not to conform, then do I have to conform to what feminists are asking me to do? That's also asking conformity of a different kind. So that is the point, that you can only conceptualize freedom in this manner, that I decide whether I want to use cosmetics or not. I'll decide whether I want to wear high heels or not, because I want to do it. But could you do it right as the first step that feminists were taking against social norms, social stereotypes? Do you get the point that I'm trying to make? So to talk about sexuality, you can't just jump over and say that same-sex marriages ought to be allowed as legal when you have a legal system that criminalizes consensual relationships.
I had this out yesterday as well. Isn't there an endless loop there? Because if we argue that a woman, an empowered woman, can choose to go against feminist theory.
Which
so feminism argues for equality to avoid women being stereotyped from conforming to a certain notion of woman. And a woman says, I know that I have so and so rights, I can exercise them, and I am exercising them to conform.
To conform to what? Okay, this is the point I'm trying to get at. What you're getting at, I think you're not articulating it, that if a woman in today's context decides to wear makeup, decides to look pretty, decides to look feminine, then she's basically saying that I decide not to conform to the expectation of being a daggy looking feminist. Who said that feminists have to look daggy? Only because we had a feminine stereotype, we challenged it, and one way of challenging it is throw out everything. And now that we have that space, I choose. I want to look feminine, I don't want to look feminine.
The whole issue was about the concept of normal female and normal male. But here we are saying that everybody should have freedom to choose the way they want to look. That's it.
Alright, so now extend that to sexuality. Everyone should have the freedom to marry whoever they want to. Do I have the conceptual space to make that argument? When our system doesn't even allow consensual relationships, in fact criminalizes consensual same-sex relationships. So the point I'm making is the point that is made by Davis very often, that we are basically responding to the possibilities that our context allows. So we are influenced by our context, but it doesn't mean that we are determined by our context. So the possibility of challenging what is happening exists, but it is a possibility that happens gradually, step by step, rather than today I have decided that from same-sex relationships being criminal, I have now gone to saying same-sex people should be allowed to marry and to adopt children and the rest of it, while the criminalization is still in place. So you have to go step by step. If you did not have fundamental rights in the Constitution, could you argue for non-discrimination? How would you do it? Where is the conceptual categories? Where is the conceptual apparatus? Where is the vocabulary?
And further expanding your point, as you said, we need a step-by-step movement. So, what I believe is that allowing a same-sex marriage is a really far goal now, because firstly we need to decriminalize the same-sex marriage, but we don't have a platform to support if we make a same-sex marriage as legal, because we need a lot of marriage regulations, laws, how do we decide the maintenance if something happens. So your same argument that we don't have a required or a strong platform that can support if in future same-sex marriage are legalized. So firstly we have to decriminalize same-sex relations, then we can have a platform on which this kind of relationship can stand. Then we can move ahead whether we can actually legalize same-sex marriage or not. We can't just directly
jump to that point.
As we have done before, we can adopt a platform from other countries, like other countries are doing this.
Yeah, it's not even a question of other countries. All like we live in a global universe. We have the ideas available to us. We don't have to say because England did it, that's why we have to do it. We can talk about it on our terms. But the point here is that what I'm trying to get at is the issue is a non-issue, same-sex marriage. I'm not even suggesting that that's the way to go. But what I'm trying to show you is same-sex marriage is a non-issue for us, not only because it is a criminal activity at present, but also because we don't talk about family laws other than as religious personal laws. So what would constitute an ideal family law, a fair family law? The first thing you would have to do is, I have to define what are the relationships that will come under it. So will it be heterosexual relationships only, or could it accommodate same-sex relationships? Now, if I want to put a cat amongst the pigeons, will it only be monogamous relationships? Could it be polygamous relationships? We just take it for granted that we know what is required. We need to question every possible category to see what is being achieved by us using that category. And this is the point I was making, that the first question you have to ask if you have to enact a family law is, what is the purpose of the legislation? Do you need a marriage law? What's the problem in people living together without being married? Children will be legitimate or illegitimate. Remove that category. Why?
Security.
Of what?
Social security.
Like what? Tell me. What is the security? Tomorrow, okay, if you are a woman, if you are a professional, you are able to look after yourself, etc. It's a very small minority of our population, but even in that scenario, you are married, the guy walks out after 10 years, what is your security?
So I didn't get your question about, I mean, I heard her response, but I didn't get your question.
I was saying that if you don't have a marriage law, if you don't have a family law that says marriage is the proper relationship, and the question is whether heterosexual or homosexual or monogamous or polygamous, etc. Forget all that. Just scrap marriage law completely. What is the marriage law there for? Kushbu's point was that it will lead to social chaos. It will take away all security. I'm saying, what security do you get by having
the only fear would be then religion and the stakeholders of religion governing marriage. Otherwise, there is
religion
no.
is outside our discussion at the moment. Okay, you got to be a religious whoever. You go and do what your religion allows. It doesn't say that there is a family law and you have to come under it. You want to live under your religion, go ahead and do it. But don't come back to me and say, enforce my religious rights. To give you an example, Catholicism still does not allow divorce. Marriage under Catholic understanding is for life. Now, laws in all Catholic countries allow divorce, including Ireland. What happens to the religious instruction? Can you hear Catholics coming to the courts in these countries and saying, my religion doesn't allow it, so don't allow divorce? We don't hear that argument. And we take it for granted that that's normal. What happens in our country? Tell me. My religion allows me to, again, with the caveat that is just the most convenient example, but I can give you other examples if I work a bit harder. But my religion allows me, not in that it makes me do it, it allows me to do something, to marry more than once. What do I say? The law has to enforce it, not that my religion, I can keep doing what my religion allows.
Provide another kind of an example. That, all right, when it comes to the whole question of divorce, you say that, or you will look at the Indian Divorce Act and accepting for what is permitted there or not permitted. And if you are a Catholic and it's not permitted by your religion, we do not provide you for any exit point. If you look at the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act very clearly permits you to have an abortion if a family planning device fails. Nobody asks you what religion you are having, whether your religion permits it, doesn't permit it, it's irrelevant. So wherein you feel it is suitable for you, for your larger policy, you don't then go and ask. Because again, in the Catholic system, you forget about having an abortion, you don't even allow the use of a family planning device. You, at the most, what has been now permitted is, all right, you permit a certain amount. Either you permit the use of the, what are seen as the, I'm forgetting the exact term, but you might allow either for a withdrawal, before ejaculation, or you might permit the whole use of looking at the menstrual period and finding out what is your period of fertility or otherwise. And I think it's a very telling example, which again demonstrates to us that the so-called public and private is so conveniently constituted, and your deference to religion or otherwise is also works accordingly. And it's a very stark kind of example, because when it comes to reproductive, any sort of meddling there, that is wherein Catholics have taken a way more non-negotiable stance than has been done even in relation to divorce.
Absolutely. And that is a very good example for us that right to abortion, women all across industrialized countries have fought tooth and nail for it, like it has been a very hard-won right. What has happened in our country? Nobody asked for it. The state went and enacted the Medical Termination Pregnancy Act. If any of you want to do a thesis on that, absolutely gold mine of stuff. That is, the state comes in as a measure of population control, brings in the Medical Termination Act, wipes out any possibility of arguing religious prohibition. So we will not give you equal property rights because religion doesn't allow it. Religion also doesn't allow medical termination of pregnancy. We will not even go there. So what happens to this religious versus secular ideas, public versus private ideas? So the point of the exercise is for us to have our antennas up all the time, that the categories that we are using are categories that serve the, if you like, the current, whatever the political agenda is. And if it is discriminatory to any section of society and you do not make it problematic, then you are perpetuating the discrimination. So then,
so you have this entire way of looking at abortion from what you call as the pro-life and pro-choice way. My issue somewhere is that when abortion is provided to you in this manner by state law, and consequently it is very easy to be using abortion in a son preference country as a mechanism of, furthering that preference. You're saying, all right, we do not permit amniocentesis, we don't permit you to get the test, but you're finding increasingly that an ordinary ultrasound can get you to know. That's one aspect. Which is then a whole range of pressure mounts to go ahead for abortion as a way of, advancing a specific way a society wishes to be. Secondly, it has been well established medically that abortion as such is really suicidal to the health of the woman. So when you use abortion as a birth control matter, and you do not look at whether it is like the kind of research that you're doing in relation to the female condom, whether it's in relation to what are the other kinds of consequences, you have to that extent, though you have permitted abortion, I'm really very, I have my own doubts about it, whether I could ever categorize it as a pro-choice thing.
Absolutely, that's the point. That it is
I just wanted to expand that.
Yeah, it is not, that is precisely the point I'm trying to make, that we have provided for medical termination of pregnancy not as a women's right, not as a bodily autonomy, not as a pro-choice measure, but as a state wanting birth control as a population control measure, with damaging consequences to the health of women who undergo that. The point being that where does religious prohibition come in here? Or where does that argument come in that we don't go where religion has its domain? So if nothing else, it should alert us to that the categories that we are using are problematic. So going back to the sexuality argument then, what are the categories that we are very comfortable with? And the point was made earlier that it is not only heterosexual, homosexual. This idea that sexuality can be categorized into neat boxes has been well and truly challenged. So what is the business of the law to be regulating any kind of sexuality? Alright, so your marriage law is looking more and more complicated. So not only it allows heterosexual unions, it allows same-sex unions, can it also allow transgender? Who are you to tell me that I cannot marry because of my sexuality? What right have you got to do that? But we do it. How do we do it? By using categories as if sexuality is this or that and nothing in between. Alright, what about fluid sexuality? What should the law be doing about that? Can we get rid of all this and say, really, if two people want to get together, let them get together. We don't really call it marriage or anything else. Why don't we do that? Historically speaking, what you were getting at, that it gives you security, is basically the security was supposed to be that in a heterosexual union, in a society like ours, primarily child care work happens through the woman. For most of you who are highly professional women, do as well as your male counterparts. I said to you at the beginning, not as something to make you feel depressed about, but just to face reality, that in 10 years' time, you will probably, most likely find that your male colleagues are much higher in the professional ladder than you are. Why? Because society expects you to look after children. Now to explain that as my choice, as an empowered woman, forget that the choice is no choice if you don't have alternatives where you don't need to pay such a high price. Now, the security of marriage was supposed to be that within this institution, you will not be an economic actor, but you will be looked after. Or you won't be a primary economic actor, but you will be looked after. Assumption was that the marriages continue for life. But that assumption has well and truly gone. All right, so do we have to provide for marriages finishing? When the marriage finishes, what does the law give you as the non-economic partner? Is the property in your name? Is the salary in your name? Children in your name? Quite possible. So the point being that all that the marriage laws or family laws, generally speaking, allow you at the end of a relationship is pittance of a maintenance. Pittance. If anyone wants to do a research project, do a research project on what kind of maintenance amounts are allotted by the courts and what kinds of reasoning they give for allowing maintenance for most women. And for Muslim women, we of course have the Shabano and the following disasters. So what security did marriage give you? Wouldn't it be better to throw out the pretense and say we'll stay together, but we will look after each other? Yeah.
The normal compensation now which is given is 800 to 1000 rupees per month. It's normal.
And even as a student, it's difficult to live on that. And if you have 2 or 3 children that you have to look after, you might as well be forgetting about having a meal on your table every day. Right? So what security did marriage give you? Wouldn't it be better that we say that if you have a relationship and if you have children, anything that you earn is divided between the 2 of you half and half by law every month, not at the end of a relationship. Any property that you have is divided half and half between you and your partner. Doesn't matter who is doing the earning and who is doing the care work. Can we imagine that? Where is the space for us to even start asking these questions? I think as law students, it has to be our responsibility to be asking our family law teachers, what are you teaching us? Don't do it actually, just think about it. Think about that this is the subject matter of family law, not whether Sharia gives me this and Hindu law gives me this and maybe Indian Divorce Act or Indian Succession Act gives me this. So this is the point. And this is the point I want you to relate to the sexuality argument, that the assumption that law is about heterosexuals is what is being challenged. One way forward is to say that, okay, whatever the heterosexual family has, the homosexual family can have also. A more fundamental challenge is to say how are the categories of sexuality decided, how does public and private pan out in this area, and that's what queer theory is doing, and saying rather than giving us step-by-step law reform, really we need to start asking what does sexuality have to do with identity, like do I always have the same sexual identity? How do I acquire my sexual identity? If identity is not fixed in stone and it is fluid, what would be the legal response? So then you start asking, is sexuality essential to my identity? So we talked about it briefly yesterday about essential differences between one category of people and another. Here is the quintessential example for you. What is the difference between somebody who's heterosexual and somebody who's not? If today I have a hetero preference and tomorrow I don't, am I allowed to do that? Or I was born a heterosexual and I will die a heterosexual. We always look at it from the perspective of homosexuality. Why not from the perspective of what is so normal about heterosexuality? And this is a point I had made yesterday, that when you're talking about racism, when you're talking about race theory, you cannot only talk about non-whites. What is the issue for non-whites is basically because what is the taken for granted privilege for whiteness. So whiteness has to be your category of analysis. So to think about it, should heterosexuality be the category of analysis? What is it that allows us to make it look like the norm, natural, inevitable, and everything else can fall in place? But no, we keep trying to accommodate the difference of homosexuals rather than looking at ourselves and saying, what is it that has allowed us to assume that heterosexuality is the norm? All right. I think I have done enough talking for a year, and I will stop here. So thank you very much for, yeah.
One point I had when we talked about decriminalization or removing the law, I mean repealing such law, are we expecting too much from law when we think of removing or having a social change or having a social, removing a social evil? As lawyers, do we think that law is only important, or do we expect too much from law? And such changes, I don't think such changes are law's forte. Society is something which should cater to these.
I think I'll make other
What we are saying is not that law is going to bring the social change. What is being said is that when you have a law which criminalizes homosexual activity, then you are a barrier to any kind of other activity happening. So it's like, you can take any number of examples on that count. It is like supposing I say that the whole business of the point which Archana was making earlier, when she said you do not have the mental space of talking about same-sex marriages because you can't even disclose a sexual preference. The moment you disclose a sexual preference, you are in trouble with the law. Now the law is, all that you're asking for the law is saying you exit, you leave this sphere, it is not your business. Similar kind of point she was making in relation to the whole phenomena of why does the law need to regulate who you marry or who you don't marry, whether you stay with somebody with marriage or otherwise, how do you maintain your entire set of relationships. It is like what the answer which Khushbu gave us, it gives us social security. And then as we talked it further, we actually found it damn all does nothing. All that it does, it curtails my imagination to think in terms of how do I want to relate with an individual at different points of time. In the film world, and that's interesting because relatively the kind of sexual choices that they make or the sort of relationships that they forge, they feel a relatively greater freedom to be able to do it more openly because they're seen as a class apart. But you'd find very constantly that people have been living with each other, have been carrying on a relationship which they find as very robust, and then they decide to have a child. And when they decide to have a child, very often people decide to also get married, and the only reason at that point they decide to get married is they do not want that child should anyway be, should feel jettisoned or should be feeling under defense because the parents have made more choices which are totally theirs. So they do not want that their choices should curtail the choices of their child, and hence they make that kind of decision. Some people do not feel that is even important and go further ahead. What I'm trying to get you to appreciate is nobody is saying that the law is going to facilitate that change in sense of saying that, all right, you should have this or that preference. But the law should not be a barrier for me to think whether it should be this or that preference. If you look at the whole phenomena of, and if there's a poster which Paramita Vora has left, which will be put up in the dining hall. It's a fascinating poster where she's got this whole, kind of a taxonomy of love, of relationships. And she's got that entire bit. It's a perfect queer poster where you're talking in terms of friendship without sex, friendship with sex but no romantic relationship, talking about a person who's happy being alone, talking about a person who wants, like a range of things that you put out there, and letting people say that, all right, you work it out for yourself, what you want to do. You also work out then that relationships of various kinds, especially if you have economic, financial components coming in, that's the point at which maybe you might require that you either enter into a facilitated contract, the whole business of transactional work, which is only looked at in the context of corporations, would be equally looked at in the context of human relationships, where you could say that, all right, we are entering into this partnership or this friendship, when if it doesn't survive, then this is the manner in which whatever we have, whatever kind of economic resources we have produced can get sorted out that way. So you're using the law very facilitatively, but you are using it. The law is not determining things for you. I think the point which is being made on a constant basis is no one has the slightest illusion that the law can provide you with this, but the law can prevent you from getting it, and that's the only thing that one is doing.
All right. So basically, it's not saying that we can leave the law aside and keep moving. The point is, law prevents me from doing so many things, and that is the point. And law prevents me from doing so many things in the name of that it is for the greater good. It is for whatever. That is what is being questioned from the perspective of marginalized sections of society, and that is the message that basically the course is giving you, that you have to start looking at law as it affects not the mainstream but the marginalized sections of society, and all in the name of rule of law and fairness.
So I have a question not related only to this class, but okay. Yeah. But I have a question. Now we got to know a whole lot of things, a whole lot of topics. We had a good discussions and all of that. At least for me, it was an eye-opener, for thought-provoking for some sense. But then when we see around in reality, the reality is quite in contrast with what we studied and discussed. So, like, how do you reconcile with that? Like,
all right. So reality is really there, or it is there because we have been bludgeoned into thinking that that is inevitable, that is natural, that is out there. So all the tools of analysis that Davis is providing us is basically to challenge this notion that reality is out there and I have nothing to do with it. So what I have to do with it as an individual also is to start questioning what is presented to me as normal, as a reality. And if sufficient number of us do it, then the reality molds itself. So that is the point of Foucault and discourse, that basically we constitute reality, so-called reality, molds us. So I cannot ask for same-sex relationship while same-sex relationship as marriage while it is criminalized. If I take it that that is the reality, how will anything change? I have to change it. I have to start. Responsibility lies with each one of us.
There was the only Harry Potter movie I watched. There was this one sentence which stayed with me where, I think at some point Harry says this, I do not know whether this is real or all in my mind. And the response which comes is that what says, or what makes you believe that what is in your mind is not real. So I genuinely do think that what one is trying to put forth here, and it's an ongoing kind of, Archana's coming here has started a dialogue for us. Hopefully she'll come many more times. Hopefully also the dialogue will continue in other courses. What is being said basically is, and that's why, though she and I were having this back and forth, that Do you think if we had called it rethinking jurisprudence, more people would have got interested? You know, as a marketing angle. But from a political angle, it is extremely important that it's called gendering legal education. Because what you're trying to somewhere say is that we are presenting law and legal education in very unproblematic terms and making it like it's all about your knowing how to open the door of every subject of law that we teach you. If you get the key, it's all sorted out. That's all. You open it up, it tells you, gives you all the information. Once you know the information, you're sorted. The truth of the matter is, even before you pass out your law school, most of the information we give you is outdated, is obsolete. And we do not at any point of time either teach you to critique that information and to say, is it really the kind of thing which is operating or something more? We don't even teach you how to construct, you know, if I have to organize this set of affairs, how do I go about doing it? What Archana has been trying to do with this whole series of lectures, and whenever you think back, she's trying to somewhere say to you, whichever area of law you are studying, doesn't matter, contracts or family or company or taxation, there is an objective behind that area of law, and it sort of markets something to you. It is marketing a particular idea to you. Before you buy that idea, you sort of think it out. All right, they're saying this. Do I accept it? If I accept it, why do I accept it? What is it that appeals to me? Is it a pragmatic choice I'm making? Is it a justice choice I'm making? Is it a contextual choice I'm making? Because at this point of time, there's nothing else I can do, but I continue to be bothered. I continue to be bothered, and if you are bothered, I think all of us have this thing, no? It's like sometimes you have just 200 rupees on you, and you have 500 rupees worth of debt. You then have to think your heart out as to how are you going to manage with the 200 rupees without getting disgraced, and work out which person I can request, which thing I have to spend on, it's that kind of a activity that one is putting forth, that it's a provocation to think. It's an open provocation to think. And to think for yourself, but not like for yourself, where you lock yourself up in your hostel room and saying, "Aaj to main sab soch ke niklunga." Not at all like that. It is about engaging with things which are happening around you. It's about asking people, if you are wanting me to believe this or that, then why? And then for yourself, okay, which of these works better or worse for me? I'm just saying this one thing in relation to the assignments, because we said it as the class was sort of like trooping out. What the assignments are requiring from you is not to say, okay, Archana ma'am and Amita ma'am, if both of them are going to correct it together, they both hate positivism, if we kill it, we are sorted. I just want, hate or dislike or have a problem with it. You make the strongest kind of a case for positivism. You think it through. You could max the course. That's not the issue. What one is asking you to do is that do not accept in an unquestioning manner anything which anybody at all gives you, even us. If you do that, that's what the assignment is requiring from you. It is mediating it through the examples we're giving you. But the more important part of it is this, that agonizing should be there in the way you write your paper. You should little bit die in the doing of it. Little bit die in the doing of it. So if that works out and that comes through, I think we would, and I may or may not evaluate, but I'll definitely read, that I can assure and promise sort of things. So I do not know if anybody has a pending question. Otherwise, I would just say that let's sort of give a big hand to... See, I asked for the big hand. The standing ovation has come on its own.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed haranguing you. I hope you'll remember some of it. Thank you. You've been very good.